Dave Lundquist, do you have my sermon? That does shorten the service considerably. It is possible to live in peace. Taking you back today to the turn of the 19th century, 1803, Adin Ballou was born, a distant cousin of Jose Ballou, who at the time was preaching Universalism, and his treatise on atonement was winning many converts to this religion. Universalists believed that a loving God would not give eternal punishment in hell. When Adin Ballou was 19, he, under the influence of his distant cousin Jose, became convinced of this doctrine. He writes in his autobiography, "In the year 1822, after much anxious inquiry and many trying exercises of mind, at length I found repose in the full persuasion that God, through Jesus Christ, will finally restore the whole human family to holiness and happiness." His conversion must have been powerful, for immediately he became a preacher. In 1823, the First Universalist Church of Boston hired him as an interim pastor and considered him for a permanent pastorate before giving it to a more experienced preacher. And so he went to nearby Milford, Massachusetts, and had a successful pastorate there, until controversy broke out in the Universalist denomination. Some Universalists, like Jose Ballou, were ultra-Universalists, believing that the dead would immediately go to paradise and be with God. Others believed that some punishment after death was necessary before souls could be restored to heaven. They were called restorationists. Adin disagreed with Jose. He believed that people needed to be punished for their sins. And it's rumored that Jose, in a rather sarcastic way, said to Adin, "So you think they need to be smoked out first?" That Adin went on to form a paper to voice the views of the Restorationists, and when he did in 1831, the Milford Church fired him, because ultra-Universalism had won the hearts of most Universalists. And Adin went on to found the Massachusetts Association of Universal Restorationists and took a new church at Mendon, Massachusetts, which was affiliated with the Unitarians. It was during this time that he became friends with William Lloyd Garrison and took up the causes of abolition and pacifism. He rooted his pacifism in the biblical passage, "Resist not evil, but overcome evil with good." And so he called his form of pacifism Christian non-resistance, and made it clear that there was a lot of resistance involved in Christian non-resistance. The only resistance that was banned was returning injury to injury. And he wrote, "The almost universal opinion and practice of mankind has been on the side of resistance of injury with injury. It has been held justifiable and necessary for individuals and nations to inflict any amount of injury which would effectively resist a supposed greater injury. The consequence has been universal suspicion, defiance, armament, violence, torture, and bloodshed. The earth has been rendered a vast slaughter field. Non-resistance explodes this horrible delusion and announces the impossibility of overcoming evil with evil. By adhering to the law of love under all provocations and scrupulously suffering wrong rather than inflicting it, they shall gloriously overcome evil with good and exterminate their enemies by turning them into friends. He was so adamant about pacifism that he even questioned the need for the Revolutionary War, indicating that as a consequence of that war, slavery was prolonged and expanded in this country by the compromises needed to win that war. And he may have been right. Great Britain abolished slavery long before the U.S. He was an active protester against the Mexican War, along with Thoreau and others who thought it was a war to expand slavery into Texas. He argued that the whole history of the world demonstrates that love begets love, war, war, and peace, peace. He kept this position even as the Civil War approached. He was the leader of the Christian pacifist movements until 1859. Then John Brown attacked Harper's Ferry. The failed attempt at creating a slave insurrection changed the opinions of the liberals. Thoreau, who had previously gone to jail to protest war, became one of John Brown's greatest praisers. In fact, almost using messianic terms like he had been dying for the sins of America. Even Garrison, a pacifist, relented and said force may be necessary to end slavery. Ballou was alone in his resistance to the Civil War. In his autobiography, he wrote, "It was hard for me to understand how professing anti-war abolitions of long standing should so forget or ignore their former protests against the use of violent means for carrying forward their work and freeing the bondsmen. As to be swept in the same foaming vortex of blood and death, as for me, I remained unmoved, except for sorrow, for such a deplorable exhibition of mistaken ambition to promote a good end by evil means, and a pity for the sufferer who had rashly plunged into the lion's den." He was a purist. He was ready to let the South secede rather than fight. It's hard to imagine what would have happened in the United States if we had no Civil War, if there had been a separate country in which fugitive slaves could escape to this one without the carnage. The slaves being freed were freed at gunpoint, and their freedom was circumvented for over a century by Jim Crow laws. And then we had the Voting Rights Act in 65, which some are seeming that it's necessary to undo as they're trying to restrict voting rights again for African Americans. That the Civil War may have won slavery at the point of a gun, but it didn't win the hearts and minds of many people in this country. Ballou believed that all governments were suspect because they were all supported by military might. Instead of participating in the government, he set up an alternative community. Hopedale was founded in 1842 as a Christian socialist community. He wrote, "All property, being primarily the Creator's and provided by him for the use of mankind during their life on earth, ought to be acquired, aided, and disposed of in strict accordance with the dictates of justice and charity. Therefore, the members of this republic shall consider themselves stewards in trust under God of all property coming into their possessions, and as such, imperatively bound not to consume it in the gratifications of their own inordinate lusts, nor to hoard it up as mere treasure, nor to employ it to the injury of any human being, nor to withhold it from relief of distressed fellow creatures, but to always use it as not abusing it for strictly just, benevolent, and commendable purposes." In the mid-19th century, there were many utopian communities that were formed, and Hopedale was one of the most successful, what we would call nowadays a co-housing project, which flourished for 14 years. He advocated socialism while respecting the entrepreneurship of individuals. As a practical Christian socialist, I propose a system of society which keeps distinctly in view the preservation and promotion of all real human interest. It must not destroy, override, or impair one of them. It must recognize, promote, secure, and harmonize them all. Neither individual or social good must be sacrificed. Both must stand together on a common foundation, upheld by common bonds. And so his financing of his utopian community, which is why it was more self-sufficient than many, was that a complex thing of stockholders, from those who were only able to give a little to those who were able to give a lot. And it was only when a brother invited his brother to come invest in the community, and then the brother, instead of helping the community, said, well, maybe we should invest our money somewhere else, and convinced the member of the community to withdraw his money as well, that they became crippled financially. And then it became just an ordinary town. And Ballou continued as minister in the Hopedale Church until he retired in 1880. I tell you this history because in these times, when the most vocal voices of Christianity equate it with militarism and the expansion of capitalism, it is interesting to see a Bible-based Christianity that advocates peace and sharing of wealth. Though we may differ with the theology and the particulars of his plans and its execution, Adin Ballou, lifts a voice for peace and sharing of wealth that is carried across the years. At the end of his life, Ballou corresponded with Leo Tolstoy, who wrote his own books about Christian pacifism. And it was this form of Christianity that Gandhi became acquainted with and inspired him. And thus King also was inspired by Gandhi. And a modern heir to Ballou's legacy is a man called Dr. Walter Wink. He's a professor of biblical interpretation at Auburn Seminary in New York. He believes in nonviolence, and he champions its success. Because one of the things that is said so often is that nonviolence just doesn't work. To which Wink answers, in 1989, 13 nations comprising 1,695,000 people, 1,695,000 people experienced nonviolent revolutions that succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations. If we add all the countries touched by major nonviolent actions in our centuries, the Philippines, South Africa, the independence movement in India, the figure reaches 3,337,400,000, a staggering 65% of humanity. All this in the teeth of the assertion, endlessly repeated, that nonviolence doesn't work in the real world. Peter Kindle says that the essence of Wink's thought revolves around redemptive violence, the belief that violence saves, a belief that is very caught up in the Christian theology. The powers that Wink engages are those which employ violence to maintain dominance. This dominance of violence, ranging from literal torture and death to softer forms of humiliation and degradation, are described as the explicit focus of Jesus' life and message. The death of Jesus, rather than being a violent appeasement of bloodthirsty God, is revealed as only nonviolent means of defeating the powers, embracing the unjust suffering of violence as a means of bringing humiliation and reproach to the powerful. Ballou also was convinced that Christian non-resistance came from God and was brought to earth by Jesus. Modern Unitarian Universalists talk about affirming the inherent worth and dignity of every person. This could be our avenue towards nonviolence, because how does killing someone ever affirm and promote their humanity and their dignity? We often have high ideals and say we are protecting freedom, democracy, and even peace are used as a justification for war. We almost always condemn murder, but when it's done in large numbers by a government, it somehow changes into heroism. Ballou asked, how many does it take to change wickedness into righteousness? One man must not kill. If he does, it is murder. But a state or a nation may kill as many as they please, and it is not murder. It is just, necessary, commendable, or right. Only get enough people to agree to it, and the butchery of myriads of human beings is perfectly innocent. But how many does it take? This week I wrote in the message of the week about how good and evil can both be from the same sources. That I cited John Lennon's hymn, Imagine, saying nothing to kill or die for, no religion. And then a Christian hymn, God of grace and God of glory, on your people pour your power. Change your children's warring madness, bend them to our control. Shame their wanton selfish gladness, rich in things but poor in soul. I got an email response to my message of the week, and I'm sure many of you are happy to know that someone is praying for us. Because of my confused thought. And I was thinking, this is not a confused thought at all. There's a country duo called Big and Rich, and I think the guy called Big has on the back of his guitar a simple saying that says, love everybody. That's not too confusing. What is confusing is when we let our biases, our nationalisms, our classism, our religion, to really look at someone as others, somehow finding permission to kill them. Love everybody is not confusing. But all the gymnastics, mental and theological, that are used to perpetuate violence and war in our families and among nations is the real confusion on this planet. May we, as Unitarian Universalists, truly bless and be blessed. Amen. Our hymn was written by Adin Ballou, and I chose it for that purpose. He wrote only the lyrics, so I have no idea if the melody is singable. Chelsea will lead us along and play it through once, and we'll jump in. He's talked about years are coming. Well, probably peace is still years away, but it's not a vain hope and not something we should stop working for. Please rise as you're able and sing hymn number 166.